There is a thought experiment that has been bothering economists for 2 centuries. Imagine two people. The first person wakes up every morning, goes to work, builds something, makes something, provides something. They produce value, tangible, measurable value, and they are paid for it. The second person owns a piece of land. They wake up, they do nothing, and at the end of the month, the first person pays them. Not because the second person did anything, not because the land improved, not because anything was created, simply because the first person needed to be somewhere, and the second person owned the somewhere. This is not a hypothetical. This is the operating logic of the modern economy. And it has been getting more pronounced, more consequential, more structurally embedded for the last 5 decades. The economy increasingly rewards position over production, ownership over effort, location over labor, and understanding why explains more about the distribution of wealth in the modern world than almost any other single concept. The oldest business model in history, long before factories, long before stock markets, long before corporations, there was land. In medieval Europe, the feudal system was built entirely on land ownership. Lords owned the land, peasants worked it. The arrangement was simple. You produce. I own the ground you produce on. I collect. The justification was divine right, military protection, tradition. But the underlying economic logic was pure extraction. The Lord added nothing to the productive process. They simply controlled access to the thing the productive process required, the land itself. And the peasant, no matter how hard they worked, no matter how productive their labor, could never escape the obligation. Because they needed somewhere to live, somewhere to grow food, somewhere to exist, and that somewhere belonged to someone else. The feudal system eventually ended, but the underlying dynamic did not. It simply changed its clothes. Here is the economics that most people were never taught. In the early 19th century, a British economist named David Ricardo identified something that troubled him deeply. As Britain's economy grew, as industrialization created new wealth, as workers became more productive, why did the benefits keep flowing to landowners? Ricardo noticed a pattern. When an economy grows, wages don't necessarily rise. Profits don't necessarily rise, but rents do, almost always. Because growth increases demand for location, more people, more businesses, more activity, all requiring space, all competing for the same fixed supply of land. And the person who owns the land doesn't need to do anything differently to capture a growing share of the economy's output. The growth happens around them. They simply collect. Ricardo called this phenomenon economic rent. Not rent in the everyday sense of a monthly payment, but the income that flows to a factor of production, not because of anything the owner did, but simply because of scarcity and position. Land earns rent because it is finite and fixed. You cannot manufacture more of it. You cannot import it from somewhere cheaper. You cannot substitute it with a different technology. And because it is finite, and because human activity requires it, its owners have a structural advantage that never goes away. This is the first and most important thing to understand about property economics. The land itself never depreciates. It can't. What depreciates is the building on it. What appreciates is the ground underneath. In most major cities, the building accounts for a declining share of total property value over time. The land accounts for a rising share. In central London, Tokyo, New York, and Sydney, the land component of prime real estate is worth multiples of the structure sitting on top of it. The building is temporary, the location is permanent. The enclosure movement, when the commons became private. For centuries in England, vast areas of land were held in common. Common land where ordinary people could graze animals, gather firewood, and grow food. Land that belonged to nobody specifically, and therefore to everybody practically. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, this common land was systematically enclosed, converted from shared resource to private property, through acts of parliament, through legal mechanisms that the wealthy could afford to navigate, and the poor could not. The immediate economic effects were devastating for the rural poor. People who had subsisted on common land found themselves dispossessed overnight, without the means to produce food, without anywhere to live, without any claim on the resources they had depended on for generations. They flooded into the cities, where they became the industrial workforce that built the wealth of the Industrial Revolution. The enclosure movement was not simply a historical injustice. It was a structural transformation that converted land from a shared resource into a privately held asset and created the landless laboring class that the modern economy is built upon. The workers who built everything, who owned nothing beneath their feet, and who therefore could never stop working because there was nowhere to go. That didn't belong to someone else. The mathematics of property versus production. Here's a comparison that makes the abstract concrete. Take a skilled tradesperson, a carpenter, a plumber, an electrician. They work hard. They develop expertise over decades. They build valuable things. Their income total is bounded by their hours. There are 168 hours in a week. They can work 40. They can work 60. They can work 80 with serious effort. But they cannot work 168. And when they stop working, the income stops. Now take a person who owns a building in a growing city. They don't work. The building sits there. The tenants pay every month, whether the owner is asleep or awake, working or on holiday, sick or well. The income does not stop when the owner stops. The income is not bounded by hours. It is bounded only by the size of the asset and the level of demand. This is the fundamental asymmetry at the heart of property economics. Labor income is linear. Property income is passive. And in a world where land values keep rising, passive income keeps growing, regardless of what the owner does or doesn't do. Ricardo was right, and Henry George knew why it mattered. In 1879, an American economist named Henry George published a book called Progress and Poverty. It sold millions of copies, making it one of the most widely read economic texts of the 19th century. George's central argument was simple and devastating. As civilization advances, as technology improves, as productivity rises, as cities grow, the benefits flow disproportionately to landowners. Not to the workers who build, not to the entrepreneurs who create, not to the inventors who innovate, to the people who happen to own the right piece of ground, when the economy around them expanded. George watched San Francisco grow from a small port town into a major city, and saw with his own eyes how the growth enriched landowners while leaving workers behind. The land they stood on became more valuable because of the community that grew around it. The roads, the schools, the businesses, the workers, the infrastructure. All of that social investment flowed into land values and was captured privately by the people who owned the land, not the people who built the roads, not the people who ran the schools, not the workers who made the economy function. George proposed a radical solution, a single tax on land values. Tax the unimproved value of land, the value created by location and community, and return it to the community that created it. Leave wages and productive investment entirely untaxed. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity, and utterly threatening to the landowning class, which is perhaps why, despite its economic logic, it was never seriously implemented. The landlords were too powerful, their political influence too extensive, and the tax code was written by people who understood exactly which side of the equation they were on. The 20th century amplified everything. After World War II, the developed world experienced a remarkable period of shared prosperity. Productivity gains translated into rising wages. Home ownership expanded through government programs and cheap mortgages. A generation of ordinary people, for perhaps the first time in history, became property owners, and as property owners, they began to benefit from the Ricardian dynamic. Their land values rose, not because they did anything, but because the economies around them grew, because the cities they lived in became more desirable, because immigration brought more people competing for the same locations, because zoning restrictions, often backed by existing homeowners, constrained the supply of new housing. And so property values rose, and rose, and rose. The generation that bought homes in the 1970s and 1980s saw their primary asset increase in value by multiples, simply by holding it, not by improving it, not by working harder, not by producing more, by owning something that became more scarce relative to the demand for it, and the generation that followed found themselves priced out, unable to afford the entry ticket, paying rent to the people who got in before them, funding other people's asset appreciation with their own labor income. The Ricardian rent extraction had moved from the feudal manor to the suburban cul-de-sac. The fire economy. Economists have a name for what the modern economy has become. Fire, finance, insurance, real estate, the sectors that produce returns from position rather than production, from ownership rather than effort, from extracting a share of value created by others rather than creating value themselves. Between 1970 and 2020, the financial and real estate sectors grew dramatically as a share of the American economy. Their profits grew even faster. In 1950, the financial sector accounted for roughly 3% of American GDP. By 2020, That figure was approaching 10%. And the real estate sector, it, when measured including the imputed rent of owner-occupied housing, adds another 12 to 13%. Together, finance and real estate now represent roughly 20 to 25% of the American economy, sectors that primarily redistribute and extract value rather than create it. This is not a coincidence. It is the logical endpoint of an economic system that taxes labor more heavily than land, that allows the value created by community investment to be captured privately, that permits unlimited wealth accumulation through property ownership, while workers face the natural ceiling of their working hours, the political economy of property. Here is where the story becomes explicitly political. Property owners vote. In most democracies, older, wealthier, property-owning voters participate in elections at dramatically higher rates than younger, renting populations. And property owners have a direct financial interest in policies that keep property values rising, restrictions on new housing supply, low property taxes, favorable capital gains treatment for real estate, first-time buyer subsidies that inflate prices further, opposition to zoning reform that would allow more density. The political system in most developed democracies has consistently delivered policies in a way that protect and enhance the returns to property ownership, not through conspiracy. Through the simple mechanism of democratic majorities, composed disproportionately of property owners, voting in their own financial interests. The result is a system that has, over decades, systematically tilted the playing field, making it easier to get rich from owning things than from building things, making it harder for each generation of workers to achieve the property ownership that would put them on the right side of the equation. The latter exists, but each generation finds the bottom rung, a little higher off the ground. The data doesn't lie. In the United Kingdom, total property wealth held by households exceeded £5 trillion by the early 2020s. In the United States, residential real estate alone was valued at over $40 trillion, more than twice the annual GDP. The wealth stored in land and property dwarfs the wealth stored in productive business investment in almost every developed economy, and the income generated by that property wealth flows to those who already have it, not to those who build it, not to those who maintain it, not to those who pay to use it. The renter who pays $2,000 a month is not just funding their own housing, they are funding the mortgage paydown of their landlord, the appreciation of their landlord's asset, the retirement of their landlord's wealth, with their own labor income, every month, without end, unless they can somehow accumulate enough capital to get on the other side of the transaction, which is getting harder, with every passing year, in every major city, in every developed economy. So what actually changes, historically? Three forces have redistributed property wealth: war and destruction, which physically eliminates accumulated property values, not a strategy anyone would recommend. Taxation, land value taxes, property taxes, wealth taxes, that recapture some of the socially created value of land, historically resisted by property-owning political majorities, and supply expansion, allowing enough new housing to be built. That location scarcity decreases and the Ricardo rent premium falls. Also historically resisted by existing property owners who benefit from supply constraints. The difficulty of all three options was why the property wealth gap has been widening in almost every developed economy for the last 50 years, and why the financial returns to owning property have consistently exceeded the financial returns to building things for longer than most people alive today have been working. Ricardo identified the problem in 1817. George proposed the solution in 1879. Neither has been adequately addressed, because the people who benefit from the status quo have always had more political power than the people who pay for it. The economy rewards position over production, ownership over effort, location over labor, not because this is inevitable, not because this is natural, but because the rules that govern the economy were written by people who owned the land and understood exactly what they were protecting. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. The answers are in history, and I will show you where to look.